Chapter 2. Achieve big through small. The first anti-pattern in this chapter is to take a big bang approach to an agile transformation. To think big, start big, and learn slow. The kubler-ross curve comes from grief, and it is remarkably similar in the context of change. There is an initial peak of either, in the case of change, excitement, and that peak of excitement is then followed by a trough of disillusionment and eventually climbing out of the hole. And this happens when there is a recognition that change is hard and that impediments are not in the path, impediments are the path. So adopting better ways of working can feel very challenging and frustrating at times because it surfaces impediments that need to be removed. So if an organisation takes a big bang approach to ways of working and tries to flip the organisation overnight, you leave on Friday as a project manager, you start on Monday as a product owner or a scrum master, and everybody changes literally overnight on a Monday morning with new ways of working. There is going to be one giant kubler-ross curve. There is going to be a peak of excitement around new ways of working, fanfare, razzmatazz, publicity, and then eventually there'll be a recognition that the entire organisation are all learning to ski at the same time. The system of work is not set up for this. The level of unlearning and relearning is not where it needs to be. Everyone is unlearning at the same time. The processes, the ingrained behaviours, the incentivisation is just not set up to cater to changing ways of working. It's a risky, very, very risky approach. It also takes a lot longer than taking a achieve big through small approach, because the bigger this kubler-ross curve, the longer it takes to climb out of the hole. And typically that time of climbing out of the trough of disillusionment, climbing out of that hole, in my experience, what I've observed is typically that's 18 months to 2 years, generally speaking. And also what I've seen quite often is a CIO or COO or CEO, C-suite, executive committee members who have ended up moving on from an organisation and no longer still working there due to result of a large big bang type transformation. It is, again, a very risky approach. So the pattern here is to achieve big through small. Think big, start small, learn fast. Apply an agile mindset to agility. Humans have a limited velocity to unlearn and relearn. You cannot force the pace of change. I have learnt the hard way, you cannot force the pace of change. Even if you think you're forcing the pace of change, you're not, because it will be new labels on the same old behaviour. So there is a need to have lots of little kubler-ross curves. Start out in an area with natural innovators, natural champions. There's some good learning here from the diffusion of innovation curve from Everett Rogers, 1962. The way humans adopt change is typically normally distributed. You have your innovators, your early adopters, your early majority, your late majority, and then your laggards. So try to identify the innovators, the natural champions, start with them, beat a path through the organisational jungle. And again, the speed will be determined by the speed of unlearning and whether there is a headwind or a tailwind. There are actions that individuals and teams and people and leaders can take to generate that tailwind. For example, recognising and rewarding desired behaviour, experimentation, psychological safety. There are actions that people can take which will generate a headwind. For example, trying to do too much too soon, having weaponized metrics, for example, targets that people have to hit to get a bonus or to get promoted, a lack of psychological safety, a culture of fear, so nobody's going to experiment, and so on. So generate a tailwind, start with the innovators, and this is applying an agile mindset to agility. When you draw a normal probability distribution from the diffusion of innovation curve as a cumulative distribution, it makes an S-curve shape. And I have learnt this myself many times the hard way by trying to do too much too soon. Keep the gradient to change low to start with, so have an S-curve profile to change. Keep the gradient to change low to start with. Prove it in your context. Now you can have, in a large organization, if you have a number of business units, you might run a number of S-curves together. So for example, you could run, 5 S-curves. When you add up an S-curve, it still makes an S-curve. You're still keeping the gradient to change low. You're proving it in your individual context, and maybe different business areas have a different culture, a different background, a different history from past acquisitions perhaps, for example. So run your S-curves, keep the gradient to change low, nail it before you scale it. So only once it's working in your context do you then step up the profile, step up the gradient to change. So maybe it's 1 team, 2 teams, 3 teams, you get to 5 teams, and then it's 5 teams at a time, 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe get to 30 teams, and it's 10 at a time, 30, 40, 50, and you can start to increase the gradient because now you've proven it in your context, you've generated social proof, people are on board, it's within risk appetite, it'll be a bumpy, messy journey, there'll be 2 steps forwards, 1 step back, maybe even 2 steps forwards, 3 steps back at times it'll feel like, but eventually you make forward progress, and then the speed, the pace can then get faster as the gradient increases. So that's a key anti-pattern and pattern from chapter 2. A related anti-pattern and pattern is to scale agile without descaling the work, is the anti-pattern. So the anti-pattern here is taking a scaling framework with prescriptive practices, for example, and just applying it lock, stock and barrel across an organization, rather than allowing people to choose what framework, what body of knowledge, what set of practices will work for them in their unique context. The anti-pattern is to take a framework and apply it lock, stock and barrel across an organization where that framework has a set of prescriptive practices. I believe in every framework has value, has learning, has things to take from it. Hashtag all frameworks, not hashtag no frameworks. And the key here is for teams to experiment, to apply the framework that works in their unique context, not to mandate it top down. Also, there's an often observed problem here where a scaling framework is applied across a large team or a large area, value stream, team of teams. And actually the problem is the fact that it's not a 100, 200, 300, 500 person problem in the first place. And actually there's a need to descale the work. And actually scaling agility rather than scaling agile, scaling agility is descaling the work. In order to have more agility, more smaller teams with a very clear mission, with empowerment, high alignment, high autonomy, that results in agility. And there's an important point here around the team architecture, the way teams are set up, matching the technical architecture, which we're going to come on to in a subsequent chapter. But scaling agility is descaling the work and descaling the system of work. So you have to descale before you scale. I've seen a problem where there's been a large part of an organization apply top-down a scaling framework upon people, and it hasn't led to beneficial outcomes. The outcomes have not materially improved. However, one particular example, 5 people from what originally was a waterfall area of 200 people trying to do change in a waterfall manner. 5 people from that 200 people within 3 months had managed to achieve something that 200 people had not achieved in 2 years. And that was getting value into the hands of a customer. The problem was it wasn't a 200 person problem, it was a 5 person problem. So descale the work before you scale agile. In fact, descaling the work is scaling agility. The third anti-pattern pattern pair here is that grassroots hits a grass ceiling. This cannot be only bottom up, and it equally cannot be only top down. So bottom up, if there's a lack of leadership support to help alleviate impediments, to prioritize the removal of impediments, to prioritize things getting improved or fixed or changed, to incentivize the right behavior, to call it out as a priority so that when you go knocking on a door asking for somebody to help, you get a positive response. Without that senior leadership support, then grassroots hits a glass ceiling. There will be limited progress. A lot of the systemic impediments, in my experience, will remain in place in an organisation. Likewise, top-down only is disempowering, it's demotivating, it is command and control, especially when it's with a mandate as to how to do something. And that leads to agentic state, a term from psychology, where people absolve themselves of any responsibility for the outcomes. So if someone in a position of authority says you have to do this, then people will pretty much do anything. And we've seen this with some of the behaviour in financial services, with LIBOR rigging, with FX rigging. You know, if the tone from the top is to achieve something almost at any cost, is how it can come across. People, when in a grey area, people will prioritise what they are being asked to do. And famously, this was seen in the Milgram experiments, which is where the term agentic state comes from, in terms of what people will do when told to by someone in a position of authority. So instead, it's not only bottom up or only top down, it needs to be both. It needs to be top down meets bottom up. The top down needs to be not a mandate on the how, however, it should be incentivization and prioritization around change, which is, it is important to change. It is important to improve ways of working with psychological safety and with support. And then bottom up, there's the bottom up feedback as to what the impediments to the teams are. And these impediments need to bubble up, and there needs to be a support structure to enable these impediments to better, value sooner, safer, happier, to be able to bubble up in order that they can be resolved, prioritised and alleviated so that they are no longer an impediment for teams to deliver better, value sooner, safer, happier, to improve business outcomes. So that is chapter 2.